The inbred sisters who made their parents disappear. That's what they whispered about Clara and Maeve Blackwood in 1894. Two young women trapped in a decaying mansion in Alabama, who looked so unnaturally alike that strangers couldn't tell them apart. When their parents vanished without a trace, the sisters sat calmly at the dinner table, claiming they'd simply gone on a trip. But Dr. Alistair Finch saw something else in their vacant stares, something that made his blood run cold. In the cellar, he found a hidden room with scratch marks clawed deep into the walls. The town sheriff refused to listen. The neighbors turned away, and slowly the horrifying truth began to surface. A truth about what really happened in that house of horrors and why an entire community chose silence over justice. But when the victims become the killers, who decides what justice looks like? The summer of 1894 settled over Blackwood Hollow like a burial shroud, thick and suffocating in the Alabama heat. Dr. Alistair Finch had arrived in this godforsaken corner of creation only 3 months prior. His medical degree from Johns Hopkins still crisp in its frame, his northern sensibilities already wilting under the weight of southern superstition. The town doctor before him had died suddenly, heart failure, they said, though the locals whispered of curses and family feuds with the kind of certainty reserved for Sunday sermons. Alistair kept his practice in the center of town, a modest building wedged between the general store and the undertaker's parlor, a proximity that seemed grimly appropriate given the state of his patients' health. Most suffered from ailments that proper sanitation and education could have prevented, but suggesting such improvements only earned him suspicious glances and muttered comments about northern interference. The Blackwood family loomed over everything like a cancer, their plantations stretching across thousands of acres, their influence seeping into every corner of civic life. He had seen them only once before, that terrible August morning, the patriarch Jebediah, a man whose very presence seemed to suck warmth from the air, walking alongside his skeletal wife through the town square. Behind them trailed two young women so eerily similar that Alistair had blinked twice to ensure his eyes weren't playing tricks. Clara and Maeve Blackwood. The local gossips informed him. Sisters born 2 years apart, but looking as identical as reflections in still water. The older one, Clara, carried herself with a rigid composure that spoke of iron discipline while Maeve drifted beside her like a ghost, her gaze never quite focusing on the world around her. The knock came before dawn on the 15th of August. Sheriff Brody's fist pounding against Alistair's door with the urgency of a man who wanted this problem to disappear as quickly as possible. The sheriff was a weathered specimen of 40-odd years, his badge more tarnished than polished. His authority derived not from justice, but from his willingness to look the other way when it suited the town's powerful families. "Doc, you need to come out to the Blackwood place," Brody said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Something ain't right up there." The ride through the pre-dawn darkness felt endless, their horses' hooves clattering against the dirt road that wound through cotton fields and slave quarters that still housed sharecroppers decades after emancipation. The Blackwood mansion materialized from the morning mist like something from a fever dream, its Greek revival columns stained with years of neglect, its wraparound porch sagging under the weight of rotting timber. Sheriff Brody explained the situation in clipped sentences as they approached. A sharecropper had come to town the previous evening, claiming he hadn't seen Jebediah or Elsieth Blackwood for 3 days. The overseer had grown concerned enough to check the main house, finding the front door unlocked and the family's usual routine disrupted. The sisters remained, but their parents had vanished without explanation. The interior of the mansion struck Alistair immediately as wrong in ways his medical training couldn't quite articulate. The formal dining room table was set for 4, with plates of food in various stages of decay, suggesting a meal interrupted days earlier. Flies buzzed around congealed gravy and moldering bread rolls, while crystal glasses held the dregs of wine that had turned to vinegar. Everything else appeared meticulously maintained, not a book out of place in the library, not a cushion askew in the parlor, as if someone had taken great care to preserve the illusion of normalcy while allowing this one tableau of abandonment to fester. They found Clara and Maeve in the morning room, seated side by side on a velvet settee that had seen better decades. Clara, 22 years old, according to the sheriff's records, possessed the kind of beauty that made men uncomfortable too sharp, too knowing, too controlled. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe shiny, and her green eyes tracked Alistair's movements with predatory precision. Maeve, 20 years old, seemed carved from the same mold, but softened somehow, as if life had worn away her edges rather than sharpening them. Her identical features bore a dreamy quality that spoke of minds wandering in distant territories. "Miss Clara, Miss Maeve," Sheriff Brody said, his tone carefully respectful. "This here's Dr. Finch. We're trying to understand where your parents might have gone." Clara's response came with the practiced ease of someone who had prepared for this conversation. "Papa mentioned taking Mama to visit her sister in Mobile. She's been poorly lately, and he thought the sea air might help her constitution." Her voice carried the refined inflection of expensive education, but underneath lay something harder, steel wrapped in silk. Alistair studied both women with his physician's eye, noting details that made his skin crawl. Their resemblance went beyond normal sibling similarity into territory that suggested generations of limited bloodlines. The shape of their skulls, the placement of their eyes, the curve of their mouths, all bore the subtle markers he had learned to recognize in his medical studies. Inbreeding, while not uncommon in isolated rural communities, rarely produced such pronounced effects without causing significant developmental problems. "When exactly did they leave?" he asked, his professional curiosity overriding social niceties. Maeve spoke for the first time, her voice barely above a whisper. "Time moves strangely in this house, Doctor. Days blend together like watercolors in the rain." Her sister's hand shot out to grasp Maeve's wrist, not gently, but with the quick firmness of long practice. "What my sister means is that we've been so worried about Mama's health that we haven't been keeping careful track of the hours, 3 days, perhaps 4. The explanation felt rehearsed, polished smooth by repetition. Alistair found himself focusing on their hands. Clara's grip on her sister's wrist showing white knuckles. Maeve's fingers curled around a small wooden object that looked handmade. Their nails were clean but bitten short, and both bore small scars along their palms and forearms that suggested years of nervous self-harm. Sheriff Brody seemed eager to accept their story and leave. But Alistair's medical training had taught him to look beyond surface presentations. Something about their too calm demeanor, their too perfect explanations, their too similar appearances set off alarm bells in his mind. He had seen trauma before in his brief practice. The hollow eyes of abused children, the careful postures of women who had learned to make themselves small, and these sisters radiated both vulnerability and danger in equal measure. As they prepared to leave, Alistair noticed Maeve's grip loosened on her small wooden treasure. It was a bird carved with surprising skill from what looked like pine, its wings spread as if in flight. When their eyes met, she pressed it briefly against her chest before tucking it back into her skirts. A gesture so swift he almost missed it, yet laden with desperate significance. The ride back to town passed in uncomfortable silence, Sheriff Brody clearly hoping this would be the end of the matter. But Alistair's mind churned with questions that multiplied like bacteria in a petri dish. Where were Jebediah and Blackwood? Why did their daughter seem so unnaturally calm about their disappearance? And what secrets lurked in that decaying mansion that could produce 2 young women who looked more like mirror images than siblings? By the time they reached town, Alistair had made a decision that would change everything. He would not let this mystery rest, regardless of what the sheriff or the townspeople preferred. Something terrible had happened in the Blackwood house, and those 2 strange, beautiful, damaged sisters held the key to understanding it. The question was whether he was prepared for the horror that key might unlock. The first obstacle to understanding the Blackwood mystery came not from the sisters themselves, but from the suffocating wall of silence that surrounded their family name. In the 3 days following his visit to the mansion, Alistair discovered that asking questions about the Blackwoods was like probing an infected wound. Every inquiry met with winces, deflections, and the kind of nervous laughter that spoke of deeply buried fears. The general storekeeper suddenly found urgent business in his stockroom whenever Alistair mentioned the family. The barber's hands trembled so violently when asked about Jebediah that he nearly nicked a customer's throat. Even the minister, supposedly a man of God and truth, claimed he knew nothing beyond what everyone else did, though his eyes darted toward the church's collection plate when he spoke. Alistair's frustration mounted as he realized the depth of the Blackwood family's influence over this community. Jebediah had controlled not just the largest plantation in the county, but the economic lifeblood of virtually every family in Blackwood Hollow. His cotton fields provided work for dozens of sharecroppers, most of them former slaves who had nowhere else to turn in the decades following emancipation. The general store extended credit based on anticipated cotton harvests. The local bank held mortgages secured by land that bordered Blackwood property. Every thread of the town's fabric was woven through with Blackwood money, Blackwood influence, and apparently Blackwood fear. Dr. I. Harrison's medical files provided the first glimpse behind the curtain of respectability. Alistair had inherited not just his predecessor's practice, but also his meticulously kept records, and those records painted a disturbing picture of the Blackwood family's medical history. Elizabeth had been treated repeatedly for injuries that Harrison had delicately recorded as domestic accidents, broken ribs that healed poorly, bruises in patterns that suggested fingers and fists, burns that could not have been caused by kitchen mishaps. The entries grew more frequent and more severe in the months before Harrison's death, with notations that spoke of a woman's spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of systematic brutality. More troubling still were the cryptic notes about the daughters. Harrison had examined both Clara and Maeve multiple times over the years, and his records contained observations that made Alistair's medical training recoil in horror. References to familial irregularities and concerning anatomical presentations suggested examinations that no proper physician would have caused to conduct unless suspecting the worst kind of abuse. The final entry, dated just 2 weeks before Harrison's sudden death, contained a single line that chilled Alistair to the bone. The household secrets that would destroy men's souls. God forgive me for my silence. Determined to find someone willing to break that silence, Alistair turned his attention to the sharecroppers who worked the Blackwood plantation. These men and women, already living on society's margins, had nothing to lose from the Blackwood family's disappearance, and potentially much to gain. Yet when he approached the collection of ramshackle cabins that housed the plantation workers, he encountered fear so profound it seemed to emanate from the very soil. The first man he approached, an elderly former slave named Joshua, took one look at Alistair's medical bag and backed away as if it contained snakes. "Don't know nothing about the big house, doctor. Don't want to know nothing neither." When Alistair persisted, explaining that he was trying to help find the missing parents, Joshua's weathered face crumpled with something that might have been pity. "Some folks ain't missing, doctor. Some folks just finally gone where they supposed to be." It was Joshua's granddaughter, a young woman named Rebecca, who provided the first crack in the wall of silence. She caught Alistair as he was leaving the quarters, her voice barely audible above the evening cicadas. "You looking for truth about that family? You talked to Sarah Washington. She worked up at the big house before they sent her away. Lives in that little cabin past the creek where the road forks toward town." Her eyes darted nervously toward the plantation house, visible in the distance like a monument to malevolence. "But doctor, when you find what you're looking for, you remember that some truth's too heavy for one man to carry." Sarah Washington proved to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and hands that bore the permanent stains of countless hours spent cleaning, cooking, and maintaining the facade of respectability for people who had none. She lived alone in a cabin that was neat but sparse, every possession carefully tended, because replacing anything would be impossible on whatever meager wages she could earn, doing washing for the town's more modest families. When Alistair explained his purpose, her reaction was immediate and visceral. She began shaking her head before he finished speaking, backing toward her door as if he carried some contagious disease. "I don't talk about that house, doctor. Talking about that house is how folks end up dead or disappeared or worse." Her voice carried the weight of lived experience with violence, the careful modulation of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest changes of expression or tone. "You best leave those questions alone before they leave you alone permanent." But Alistair had not come this far to be deterred by threats, and he pressed his case with the desperate urgency of a man who sensed time running out. He spoke of his medical oath, his duty to help those who could not help themselves, his belief that whatever had happened in that house, it was not finished happening. Gradually Sarah's resistance began to crumble, not from his arguments, but from something deeper, an exhaustion that came from carrying secrets too terrible to bear alone. "Mr. Jebediah," she began, her voice so quiet, Leicester had to lean forward to hear. "He weren't like other men. Other men, they might strike a woman in anger, might take liberties when they've been drinking. But Mr. Jebediah, he did things slow and deliberate, like he was studying on the best way to break something precious, just to watch it fall apart." She paused, her hands twisting in her apron, as if the fabric could anchor her to the present moment. Miss, poor thing, she stopped being a person somewhere along the way, became more like a doll he kept around to remind himself what he could do to something beautiful. The truly horrifying revelations came when Sarah began talking about Clara and Maeve. Jebediah's control over his daughters had been absolute and perverse, treating them not as children to be raised, but as possessions to be shaped according to his twisted vision. He had kept them isolated from other children, educated them himself with lessons that mixed academic subjects with psychological manipulation, and gradually molded them into mirror images of each other in ways that went far beyond their natural resemblance. They wasn't allowed to be different people, Sarah explained, tears now flowing freely down her weathered cheeks. Had to dress the same, talk the same, even think the same thoughts. If one of them showed any sign of being her own person, he'd punish both of them until they remembered they was just pieces of him, not real girls at all. She described a household where love had been weaponized, where affection was doled out as reward for compliance and withdrawn as punishment for independence, where two young women had learned that survival meant becoming extensions of their fathers rather than individuals with their own desires and dreams. The final piece of Sarah's testimony explained why she had been dismissed from the Blackwood household. In the weeks before her termination, she had witnessed Jebediah's treatment of his daughters escalating beyond psychological control into territory that made her physically ill to recall. What he was doing to those girls, she whispered, unable to meet Alistair's eyes, weren't natural, weren't right, weren't something any decent person could stand by and watch. I tried to tell Miss Elizabeth, tried to make her see what was happening under her own roof, but she was so broke by then, she couldn't even hear me anymore. Sarah's dismissal had come suddenly, and with threats that extended beyond her own safety to encompass her extended family. Jebediah had made it clear that any attempt to spread stories about the Blackwood household would result in consequences that reached far beyond one former employee. The message had been received and understood, contributing to the cone of silence that surrounded the family's private affairs. As Leicester walked back through the darkness toward town, Sarah's words echoing in his mind, he began to understand the true scope of what he was confronting. This was not simply a missing persons case or even a straightforward murder investigation. This was a systematic decadal-long destruction of human souls carried out under the protection of wealth, influence, and a community's willful blindness. The question that haunted him was no longer what had happened to Jebediah and Elizabeth Blackwood, but whether anyone could blame their daughters for whatever they had done to finally escape their prison of horror. The weight of Sarah Washington's revelations settled into Alistair's bones like a fever, transforming his investigation from a professional obligation into a personal crusade that consumed his waking hours and poisoned his dreams. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by visions of two young women trapped in a mansion that functioned more as a laboratory for human degradation than a family home. His medical practice began to suffer as his attention drifted during examinations, his mind returning obsessively to questions of psychological damage, physical evidence, and the terrible mathematics of survival that had governed the Blackwood household for decades. The town's reaction to his continued inquiries shifted from mere unfriendliness to active hostility with alarming speed. Patients began canceling appointments without explanation, their excuses transparent and their fear palpable. The general storekeeper started charging him inflated prices for basic supplies, claiming shortages that mysteriously resolved themselves when other customers appeared. Even the local minister avoided eye contact when they passed on the street, as if proximity to Leicester might somehow contaminate his standing in the community. The isolation bore down on him with crushing force, but it also clarified his resolve. If the entire town preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths, then he would have to pursue this investigation alone, following wherever the evidence led, regardless of the personal cost. His first step was to return to the Blackwood mansion. This time, not as a passive observer accompanying the sheriff, but as a determined investigator, prepared to uncover whatever secrets the house might hold. The mansion seemed to sense his changed purpose, its decaying grandeur taking on an almost malevolent quality in the late afternoon light. The same dining room tableau remained undisturbed, the rotting food now crawling with insects that added their buzzing chorus to the oppressive silence. But this time Allister moved through the house with methodical precision, his physician's training applied to the task of diagnosis. Every room told a story of control taken to pathological extremes. Furniture arranged with military precision, personal items absent except where they served some decorative purpose, and an overwhelming sense that individual identity had been systematically stripped away from everyone who lived within these walls. The library proved particularly revealing, its shelves lined with books that painted a picture of Jebediah's intellectual predilections. Medical texts focused on anatomy and inheritance sat beside philosophical treatises on racial hierarchy and the importance of bloodline purity. Religious volumes emphasized submission and obedience, while historical works celebrated the antebellum South social order with the fervor of lost cause mythology. Most disturbing were the journals, dozens of leather-bound volumes that chronicled Jebediah's theories about family structure, genetic inheritance, and the proper development of young women under patriarchal guidance. Allister's hands shook as he read passages that detailed experiments in behavioral conditioning, observations about the malleability of young minds, and clinical descriptions of methods for ensuring absolute compliance. These were not the random musings of a disturbed individual, but the carefully documented work of a man who had approached the destruction of his family with the same methodical precision other men might bring to agricultural innovation or business management. The final entries dated just weeks before the disappearance suggested that Jebediah's control over his daughters had reached a crescendo that even he recognized as unsustainable. The cellar beckoned with the promise of answers, and Allister descended into its depths, with his heart pounding against his ribs like a caged bird. The main area contained the usual detritus of plantation life, old furniture, farming equipment, and the accumulated debris of decades. But his careful exploration revealed something that made his medical training recoil in horror. A hidden room concealed behind what appeared to be a solid stone wall, accessible only through a narrow opening disguised as a crack in the foundation. The chamber beyond was small, perhaps 8 foot square, with walls that bore the unmistakable marks of human desperation. Scratch marks gouged deep into the stone told stories of fingernails torn bloody in futile attempts to escape, while darker stains on the floor suggested bodily functions performed in captivity. A single small window set high in the wall and barred with iron provided the only source of light and air. Most chilling of all were the chains bolted to the walls at heights that corresponded exactly to the statures of Clara and Maeve Blackwood. The discovery shattered any remaining doubts about the nature of Jebediah's relationship with his daughters. This was not merely psychological abuse or even conventional physical violence. This was systematic torture carried out over years, designed not just to control behavior, but to break spirits so completely that resistance would become literally unthinkable. The room reeked of human suffering so profound that Allister found himself retching, his body rejecting the evidence, even as his mind struggled to process its implications. Armed with this physical proof of the horrors that had taken place in the Blackwood house, Allister returned to town determined to force Sheriff Brodie to take action. But the sheriff's reaction proved even more disappointing than anticipated. Rather than showing shock or outrage at the evidence of systematic abuse, Brodie listened with the weary expression of a man hearing confirmation of something he had long suspected but chosen to ignore. That room don't prove nothing about what happened to Jebediah, and Brodie said, his tone suggesting he considered the conversation already concluded. Could be they used it for storing things. Or maybe old Jebediah had some unusual disciplinary methods with his daughters. Ain't no law against a father correcting his children, even if his methods seem harsh to outsiders. The sheriff's casual dismissal of torture as mere discipline revealed the depth of moral rot that had infected not just the Blackwood family, but the entire power structure of the community. Frustrated beyond endurance, Allister decided on a direct confrontation with the sisters themselves. If the authorities would not act on evidence of their suffering, perhaps he could convince Clara and Maeve to speak for themselves, to break the silence that protected their tormentor's memory and potentially their own freedom. He returned to the mansion on a sweltering August afternoon, finding them in the same morning room where they had first met, seated on the same velvet settee as if they had not moved in the intervening weeks. This time, however, their carefully maintained composure showed hairline cracks that suggested the strain of maintaining their deception was taking its toll. Clara's hands trembled almost imperceptibly as she poured tea with mechanical precision, while Maeve's vacant stare seemed to focus and unfocus like someone struggling to remain present in a conversation that might shatter her fragile hold on sanity. When Alcester described what he had found in the cellar, both women went completely still, their breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. "I know what he did to you," Alcester said, his voice gentle but insistent. "I know about the room, about the years of abuse, about the control he exercised over every aspect of your lives. Whatever happened to your parents, whatever you felt you had to do to protect yourselves, no one would blame you for fighting back against such monstrous treatment." The effect of his words was immediate and devastating. Clara's carefully maintained facade crumbled like a dam, giving way to floodwaters, her face contorting with rage so pure and primal that Alcester instinctively stepped backward. "You know nothing about what we endured," she hissed, her cultured accent slipping to reveal something harder and more desperate underneath. "You think you can waltz into our lives with your medical degree and your northern righteousness and understand what it means to survive in hell itself." But it was Maeve's response that truly chilled him to the bone. The younger sister, who had seemed so fragile and disconnected from reality, suddenly fixed him with eyes that held a clarity sharp as broken glass. "He made the silence," she said, her voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. "But we made the ending." The admission hung in the air between them like a confession and a challenge, confirming Alistair's worst suspicions while simultaneously revealing the moral complexity that would haunt him for the rest of his days. These were not innocent victims, he had uncovered, but survivors who had chosen the ultimate form of self-defense against an enemy who left them no other options. The question that remained was not whether they had killed their parents, but whether anyone with a functioning conscience could condemn them for it. Maeve's words echoed in Alistair's mind with the persistence of a funeral bell, each repetition driving him deeper into a moral abyss that his medical training had never prepared him to navigate. He made the silence, but we made the ending. The simple declaration contained layers of meaning that unfolded like a poisonous flower, revealing truths about justice, survival, and the terrible arithmetic of human endurance that challenged everything he had believed about right and wrong. In the days following the confrontation, Alcester found himself unable to eat, sleep, or concentrate on even the most basic tasks of daily living, his mind cycling endlessly through the implications of what he had uncovered. The rational part of his consciousness, the part trained in scientific method and legal procedure, insisted that murder was murder regardless of provocation or justification. Jebediah and Elith Blackwood, whatever their crimes against their daughters, had been human beings with legal rights that included protection from vigilante justice. The proper course of action would be to report his findings to higher authorities, to seek justice through established channels, to trust that the legal system would account for the extraordinary circumstances that had driven two young women to such desperate measures. But even as these thoughts formed, Alcester knew them for the comfortable lies they were designed to preserve his faith in institutions that had already proven themselves corrupt beyond redemption. The other part of his mind, the part that had witnessed the scratch marks in that underground chamber and heard Sarah Washington's testimony about systematic torture, whispered different truths. What kind of justice could be expected from a system that had allowed Jebediah Blackwood to brutalize his family for decades without interference? What court would give fair hearing to two women whose very existence challenged social conventions about bloodline purity and family structure? What jury drawn from Blackwood Hollow would dare to condemn a man whose economic influence had shaped their entire community even in death? The moral weight of his knowledge began to manifest in physical symptoms that alarmed him as a physician even as he experienced them as a human being. His hands developed a persistent tremor that made delicate medical procedures nearly impossible. Headaches plagued him with such intensity that he sometimes found himself unable to see clearly for hours at a time. His appetite disappeared entirely, and his clothes began to hang loose on a frame that was shedding weight with alarming rapidity. Sleep brought no relief, only nightmares in which he wandered through endless corridors lined with torture chambers, each one containing victims whose faces bore the features of Clara and Maeve Blackwood. The isolation that had begun with his investigation deepened into something approaching complete social quarantine. His few remaining patients stopped coming altogether, leaving him with a medical practice that consisted mainly of treating his own deteriorating mental state. The townspeople crossed the street rather than acknowledge him, their behavior suggesting that word of his discoveries had somehow leaked despite his efforts at discretion. Even the most basic commercial interactions became exercises in hostility, with merchants treating him as if his mere presence contaminated their establishments. In his darkest hours, Alicester began to understand the true genius of Jebediah Blackwood's system of control. The man had not simply brutalized his family in isolation, but had created a network of complicity that extended throughout the entire community. Every person who had chosen to look away from obvious signs of abuse, every authority figure who had declined to investigate suspicious injuries, every neighbor who had accepted convenient explanations for disturbing behavior, all of them had become accessories to decades of torture through their willful blindness. To acknowledge the truth of what had happened in the Blackwood mansion would be to admit their own moral culpability, a reckoning too terrible for most consciences to bear. The revelation drove Alicester to seek out Sarah Washington once more, not as an investigator pursuing leads, but as a desperate man seeking some framework for understanding the impossible moral landscape in which he now found himself trapped. He found her tending a small garden behind her cabin, her movements deliberate and peaceful in a way that suggested hard-won wisdom about finding meaning in simple tasks. When she looked up and saw him approaching, her expression combined sympathy with something that might have been recognition, as if she had been expecting this visit for some time. "You found what you was looking for," she said, not making it a question, "and now you wish you hadn't." The accuracy of her assessment broke something loose in Alistair's chest, and he found himself confessing everything. The torture chamber, the confrontation with the sisters, the terrible certainty that they had killed their parents, and the impossible burden of deciding what to do with such knowledge. Sarah listened without interruption, her weathered hands never pausing in their work among the vegetables that represented her modest claim on independence and dignity. "Doctor," she said finally, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived horrors that most people could not even imagine. "You think there's some kind of justice to be found in all this, but you're looking in the wrong place. Justice ain't about punishment or courts or making sure bad people get what's coming to them. Justice is about stopping the hurt from continuing, about making sure the suffering don't just pass on to the next generation like some kind of terrible inheritance." Her words opened a new perspective that began to shift Alistair's understanding of his moral obligations. Perhaps the question was not whether Clara and Maeve Blackwood deserved punishment for their actions, but whether exposing them would serve any purpose beyond satisfying abstract principles of legal procedure. The sisters had broken free from a system of abuse that had defined their entire existence, but that freedom was fragile and could be destroyed by the very justice system that had failed to protect them in the first place. Sarah's next revelation provided the final piece of context that Alicester needed to understand the full scope of the tragedy. During her years in the Blackwood household, she had witnessed not just the systematic abuse of Clara and Maeve, but also their desperate attempts to protect each other from the worst of their father's attention. The bond between the sisters, which outsiders might interpret as unnatural or unhealthy, had actually been their primary survival mechanism, a shared strength that allowed them to endure horrors that would have destroyed either of them individually. "Them girls learned to split the pain between them," Sarah explained, tears flowing freely, as she recalled scenes that had haunted her for years. When Mr. Jebediah would take his anger out on one, the other would find ways to draw his attention to make herself the target instead. They took turns being strong for each other, took turns being broken so the other one could heal. What looks like strangest to folks who don't understand is really just love made desperate by circumstances no child should ever face. The image of two young women alternating between victim and protector, sharing the burden of survival in ways that transcended normal sibling relationships, completed Alicester's moral transformation. These were not cold-blooded killers who had eliminated inconvenient parents, but damaged souls who had finally found the strength to end a cycle of violence that had consumed their entire lives. Their crime, if it could be called that, had been an act of liberation, not just for themselves, but potentially for future generations, who would never have to endure what they had suffered. Walking back through the gathering dusk toward his lonely practice, Allister felt the terrible weight of knowledge beginning to transform into something that might eventually become wisdom. He could not undo the horrors that had shaped Clara and Maeve Blackwood, could not restore their stolen childhoods or heal the psychological wounds that would mark them for the rest of their lives. But he could choose how to use the truth he had uncovered, could decide whether justice meant punishment or protection, whether his oath to do no harm extended beyond the treatment of physical ailments to encompass the preservation of hard-won freedom from systematic torture. For the first time since Maeve had spoken those chilling words, Allister began to see a path forward that honored both his professional obligations and his human conscience, a way to serve truth without becoming complicit in further victimization of those who had already suffered beyond measure. The transformation in Allister's approach came not as a sudden revelation but as a gradual shifting of purpose, like a river changing course through persistent erosion rather than dramatic flood. Where once he had sought to expose truth regardless of consequence, he now began to consider how that truth might be wielded as a tool for protection rather than destruction. His medical training had taught him that sometimes the most effective treatment required accepting that certain wounds could never fully heal, only be managed in ways that prevented further damage. The Blackwood sisters represented such a case. Survivors whose recovery depended not on justice in any conventional sense, but on the preservation of the fragile freedom they had finally claimed for themselves. His first concrete action involved the careful destruction of evidence that could be used against Clara and Maeve. Dr. Harrison's medical records, with their cryptic notations about examinations that suggested systematic abuse, found their way into his fireplace on a cold September evening. The flames consumed years of documented suffering, each page curling into ash that Allister scattered to the wind behind his practice. Jebediah's journals from the mansion library followed soon after, their clinical descriptions of psychological experimentation and behavioral conditioning reduced to smoke and memory. The physical evidence of the torture chamber remained, but Allister carefully documented its location and condition in his own private records, while ensuring that no official report would ever guide investigators to its discovery. The legal complexities surrounding the Blackwood estate provided an unexpected opportunity for more constructive intervention. With both parents missing and presumed dead, their vast holdings faced a complicated probate process that could drag on for years. While lawyers and distant relatives fought over the inheritance, Allister had maintained correspondence with several former classmates from medical school who had pursued careers in law, and through careful inquiries disguised as intellectual curiosity, he began to understand how inheritance law might be manipulated to serve his purposes. The key insight came from a lawyer friend in Mobile who specialized in estate planning for wealthy families. In cases where parents disappeared without clear evidence of death, he explained the law generally presumed their demise after a period of 7 years. However, if the missing persons had left behind minor children or dependent, courts could appoint guardians to manage the estate in the interim, ensuring that family assets continued to provide for those who had been financially dependent on the deceased. While Clara and Maeve were legally adults, their documented history of isolation and apparent psychological fragility could potentially support a case for continued oversight and protection. Working through intermediaries and carefully crafted legal documents, Allister began to lay the groundwork for a guardianship arrangement that would place the Blackwood estate under the management of a court-appointed trustee. Specifically, a trustee who understood the true nature of the sisters' situation and would prioritize their welfare over profit maximization. The process required delicate maneuvering through local legal channels corrupted by decades of Blackwood influence. But Allister's position as the family's physician provided him with standing to raise concerns about the sisters' capacity to manage their own affairs in the wake of their parents' traumatic disappearance. More immediately, he began to use his medical practice as a vehicle for addressing some of the systemic problems that had enabled the Blackwood family's reign of terror. The sharecroppers who worked the plantation had been denied adequate medical care for generations, their health problems ignored or dismissed as inevitable consequences of their station in life. Allister started making regular visits to the plantation quarters, ostensibly to check on the welfare of workers who might be affected by the uncertainty surrounding their employer's fate, but actually to provide the kind of comprehensive medical attention they had never received. These visits revealed conditions that shocked even his northern sensibilities. Children suffering from preventable diseases, adults crippled by untreated injuries, families living in structures that barely qualified as shelter. All of it accepted as natural order by a community that had been taught to expect nothing better. Allister began to document these conditions with the same meticulous attention he had once applied to investigating the Blackwood mystery, but now with the goal of building a case for systematic reform rather than criminal prosecution. His work among the sharecroppers also provided opportunities to gather intelligence about the sisters' current situation without directly approaching them. The plantation workers, initially suspicious of any white doctor's motives, gradually began to trust him as his consistent presence and genuine concern for their welfare became apparent. Through careful questioning disguised as medical history-taking, he learned that Clara and Maeve had begun to emerge from their isolation following their parents' disappearance, occasionally walking the grounds of the plantation and even speaking briefly with some of the workers. These reports suggested a gradual healing process that filled Allister with cautious hope. The sisters were apparently beginning to reclaim some measure of normal human interaction, testing the boundaries of a freedom they had never previously experienced. Clara had been observed reading to some of the workers' children, her cultured education finally finding a constructive outlet after years of being weaponized against her own development. Maeve had shown interest in the medicinal plants that some of the older women cultivated. Her fragmented consciousness, perhaps finding stability in the concrete realities of traditional healing practices. The decision to make one final visit to the Blackwood mansion came after weeks of careful consideration and preparation. Allister understood that his previous confrontation with the sisters had been traumatic for all involved, driven by his own need for answers rather than any concern for their well-being. This time he approached them not as an investigator seeking truth, but as a physician offering care to patients who had endured unimaginable trauma. He found them in the mansion's conservatory, a glass-walled room where had once tended exotic plants that were now dying from neglect. Clara sat at an old piano, her fingers moving across keys that produced sounds more haunting than musical, while Maeve tended to the surviving plants with careful attention. Both women looked up when he entered, but their expressions held none of the fear or anger that had marked their previous encounter. Instead, Allister saw something that might have been curiosity, as if they were finally ready to discover what kind of relationship might be possible with someone who knew their secrets, but chose not to use them as weapons. The conversation that followed was unlike any Allister had experienced in his professional or personal life. Instead of discussing their parents' fate or the evidence of their crimes, they talked about the future tentatively, carefully, but with growing confidence, as they realized that Allister had come to offer support rather than judgment. Clara spoke of her desire to use her education to help the plantation workers' children, while Maeve expressed interest in learning more about medicinal plants and healing practices. These were the first genuine personal ambitions either sister had ever been allowed to voice, and their emergence marked a crucial step in their recovery from a lifetime of systematic suppression. When Allister finally prepared to leave, he offered them something that no one else in their lives had ever provided: choice. He explained the legal arrangements he was working to establish, the protections he was trying to put in place, and the support systems he hoped to create. But he made it clear that all of these efforts were contingent on their consent, that they would have the final say in how their lives proceeded from this point forward. The power to make decisions about their own existence was perhaps the most precious gift he could offer to two women who had never been allowed to exercise such agency. Walking away from the Blackwood mansion for what he knew would be the last time, Allister felt a profound sense of completion that had nothing to do with solving mysteries or achieving justice in any conventional sense. Instead, he had discovered something more valuable and more rare: the possibility of redemption through protection rather than punishment, healing through empowerment rather than exposure, and peace through acceptance of moral complexities that defied simple resolution. The sisters would carry their secrets and their scars for the rest of their lives, but they would carry them as free women rather than perpetual victims. And that transformation represented the only kind of justice that truly mattered.